introduce today's speaker. We have Dr. Joe Neal. Dr. Neal is a professor of weed science and extension specialist for weed management in landscapes, nursery crops, and Christmas tree production in the Department of Horticultural Science at NC State University. He received his PhD in weed science from NC State University in 1984 and then joined the faculty of Cornell University, where he was responsible for research and extension programming for turf grass and nursery crops. After 12 years of watching weeds freeze in upstate New York, Dr. Neal then decided he would join the faculty at NC State in 1996. His research and extension programs emphasize development of cost-effective weed management solutions for nursery and landscape professionals. His research program also includes assessment of biopesticides and biological control agents for weed management. He is the past president and fellow of the Northeastern Weed Science Society and has served on the board of directors for the Weed Science Society of America. So he is a wealth of knowledge and experience, and he is going to share some of that with us today. So with that, Dr. Neal, I will go ahead and hand things over to you. Let me share the screen real quick, make you a presenter so we can get things started.
Okay, thank you very much. I am going to now switch over to sharing my screen. And okay, so we're going to talk about invasives, but the subtitle could be something like, oh, what a beautiful weed. Okay, because a lot of our invasive plants, particularly in urban areas, were introduced as ornamental shrubs, trees, vines, or flowers. But they have escaped their cultivation and landscape sites to become, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get my picture away from the image. Webcam closed by the organizer.
I can turn that back on for you. I thought I was moving it myself. So if you would like me to turn your webcam back on, I will. Hold on.
Oh, I'm sorry. It just distracted me for a moment. It came up right in the middle of my screen and was.
I'm sorry about that. You should be good to go now.
Let me get back to my point, whether the webcam is there or not. Urban invaders. So in our urban green spaces, we have a lot of species, invasive plants that have escaped their original intent and have become invasive. So we're going to talk about some of the most common ones and their control principles. So again, our urban lots and greenways have been fertile grounds for invasive species to establish and proliferate. But the first step in any of this, in any weed management plan, is to make sure that you are recognizing the weed. So which one is a weed and which one here is native? Does anyone recognize the one on the left? That is kudzu flower. Now, a lot of people don't get close enough to the kudzu to realize that kudzu actually has quite a beautiful flower and fragrance. When I encountered the one on the right, groundnut or apios, it's a native of North Carolina wetlands. For the first time I saw it, I thought we had a young wisteria because it didn't have flowers on it to easily identify it. So it's important to recognize what's a weed and what's not a weed. So we got to first step, of course, with any pest management plan is to identify and know your target. All right. These invasive plant species are impacting our environment. They're impacting native habitats. They're endangering rare plant species, changing ecosystems, increasing fire intensity, creating habitat for increased rodent populations, but they're also impacting human health and impacting practical things like storm cleanup costs for municipalities. Human health, you might ask, well, giant hogweed, a federal noxious weed, has recently been found in North Carolina. It causes severe allergic dermatitis. And this image shows a fairly severe reaction to it. But what's really scary is, when this plant is dormant, the hollow stems are something that are very attractive to children. They might grab those hollow stems and pretend they're trumpets, and there are a lot of instances in the literature of children being exposed to this and having really, really painful dermatitis reactions. The city of Mecklenburg County, reported a few years ago how their storm cleanup costs were being affected by invasive species, because when high winds from a tropical storm or hurricane came through the county, the high winds caught these invasive vines like wisteria and brought down trees that otherwise would not have fallen during that storm event. So invasive species are more than a nuisance. They're more than a natural areas problem. They're impacting cities and counties and governments and our populations in many, many ways. So what kind of plants are we going to talk about today? We have grasses, we have forbs, we have shrubs, vines, trees have all invaded our green spaces. We're going to talk about each of these plant classes and what our management practices and principles of management can be for these different things. So controlling invasive plants. We'll talk about the grasses. So annual grasses like microstegium, we can address with pre or post-emergent strategies. Perennial grasses, we've got to remove them or use post-emergent herbicides. Invasive species that are on a regulated list like Cogongrass, we want to focus more on eradicating local populations before they can establish early detection and rapid response. Forbs and ground covers, timing of herbicide application seems to be quite critical for those species. And in woody weeds, whether they be shrubs, vines, or trees, we have a lot of the same management tactics available to us, like manual removal, foliar applications of herbicides, basal bark treatments, and cut stem treatments. And we'll talk about each of these tools as they are appropriate for different invasive species. So first up is Japanese stiltgrass. This is actually one of the most widespread invasive species in the eastern United States.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Joe, but we're having some issues viewing your screen. It's kind of cutting off the top and side, so you can't see the full screen.
Okay.
I don't know if it's something to do with how you've got your slideshow set up.
I have no idea.
Let's see.
No idea. Okay, so let's do something else. How about if I just show that? How does that show on your screen?
It shows the full screen, but we still see the slides on the side of upcoming. You can maybe minimize that by using your mouse and kind of yes, and just drag it over to make it small.
Yeah,
that might work. That should work.
Yeah. So are you able to see the full slide?
Yes.
Okay. Why don't we'll just do it like this. This will work just fine.
All right.
As long as you can see it. Okay. So Japanese stiltgrass, non-native summer annual grass, common in our wetlands, utility easements, wood, parklands, shady lawns and landscapes. This invasive grass really doesn't compete with established trees and shrubs, but it will reduce seedling recruitment in our forest areas. And of course, creating this thick monoculture, it can decrease the survival of our forbs, our native forbs. All right. So Japanese stiltgrass, as I said, is a summer annual life cycle that's very similar to crabgrass, and its control practices are similar to crabgrass. However, it does have a few unique features. It germinates in very early spring, about 2 weeks before crabgrass does. It sets seeds later in the season, much later than most other summer annual grasses. In fact, it is just now starting to put up its flower heads in central North Carolina. It's already seeding out in the mountains, but in the central part of the state, it's just now starting to flower. So it's very late in the season compared to other grasses. And what that means is we actually have a very long season to implement control measures that can prevent seed production, anywhere from early spring to early fall, so around the 1st of September, right? And the target, or the most important thing for Japanese stiltgrass, is to prevent seed production, whether that is through manual removal or chemical controls or late season mowing. You want to reduce seed production because the seeds are not long lived. Most of the literature cites a 7 years survival for the seeds in the soil. That's based on one experiment and 1 year of data. Our data over a 3-year study show that after 2 years of control, we basically reduced seed populations in the soil by about 98, 99%. So really the seed are very short-lived in the soil compared to other annual weed species. Now, having said that, the thing you always have to remember with Japanese stiltgrass is it is moved and spread by surface water movement and by animals. The seed have small barbs on them. So animals and birds will spread those seeds. A surface sheeting action of water movement will move the seeds. Obviously, flooding events will cause movement of the seeds, and human activities move the seeds in green spaces. So even though you may get 99% reduction in the seed bank, you're still going to have some emergence. And that's what makes controlling Japanese stiltgrass such a challenge, is you can do a very good job eliminating it over a period of 2 or 3 years, and then an environmental event such as a flash flood happens and you're starting over again with a big population. Okay. Well, how do you manage it? If you are in an urban area and you've got parklands that are infested, the lawns can get infested, and that's a seed source for water that moves off of that. You can control it in lawns by just improving turfgrass management. A dense turf will outcompete Japanese stiltgrass. But in the meantime, while you're getting your turf density improved, you can control it like it was crabgrass with a pre-emergence herbicide applied in February, and pretty much any of our pre-emergence herbicides labeled for crabgrass control in turf systems will control it, okay? Mulches don't work on it because it is evolved to grow in shady environments and in fact emerge through its own thick straw mulch, all right? Late season mowing can reduce seed set by over 90%, but what that doesn't mean continuous mowing. That means an area like in a greenway where it's grown up, you can mow it down very close to the ground, and if you time it well, you can reduce your seed set tremendously. But I'll show you something in a moment. That mowing has to happen before the flowers have started to form in the leaf sheaths. Okay, I'll show you a photograph in a moment on that. There are post-emergence herbicides that control stiltgrass. Overall, stiltgrass is fairly easy to control with herbicides. We have selective grass herbicides such as Fusilade, Segment, Verdict, Acclaim. There are and Envoy. All of them work selectively in controlling stiltgrass. And you see the photograph of a Segment, which is sethoxidum application on the right-hand side. Also, low doses of glyphosate are very effective. Applications as little as 1 quart of a 41% formulation of glyphosate on an acre, and that's a pretty low dose, can provide essentially complete control of stiltgrass. Again, as I said before, it germinates very early, goes to seed very late in the season. So we have a wide window of opportunity to spray, and these herbicides work pretty much at any time of the year. However, later season treatments on heavy infestations are obviously going to miss some of the plants because the stiltgrass just grows over itself. And these are all foliar absorbed. So because of that, 2 applications often work much better than 1. And here's a photo from one of our trials where we did 1 application of segment, and it was a dense population, so there was a lot of escaped plants. Or a lot of plants in there that escaped the first application. A second application gave us basically 99.9% control. Okay. Flaming is an option as well. If you're in a sensitive environment and you can't use, you don't want to use herbicides, flame weeders are effective. Controlled burns generally are not effective in the long run on stiltgrass, but using a flame weeder like we use herbicides to kill the existing populations can be effective, right? And particularly effective in, say, a wetland area where you're really concerned about the use of any chemical applications, right? Now, in any operation where you're using flame weeders, clearly you have to be concerned about the risk of fire. So you never do this as a single person in the field. Always have someone there helping you, and be prepared to extinguish any flames. And remember, you do not have to light the weeds on fire when you're using flame weeders. That's not how flame weeders are intended to be used. The flame weeders really are just cooking the insides of the plant cells. So it is a very brief exposure of the flame, the heat from the flame, to the weed tissues. And you heat up the insides of the plant, and then the plant just collapses. And you'll see the results within half an hour to an hour. You can see which weeds have been adequately treated and which ones have not. Just like the herbicide treatments, multiple treatments will be more effective than a single application. Okay, what about perennial grasses? Well, one of the most widespread perennial grass weeds that we're dealing with in our region is Miscanthus. Miscanthus, of course, was introduced as an ornamental grass and is still widely sold throughout most of the US. And it has escaped cultivation. It is now very common in roadsides, roadways, edges of forests, and in pastures. Okay, but it is not well adapted to shade of dense forests. So as you enter an intact forest, as you move deeper into the forest, you're going to see the Miscanthus is less and less prominent in those situations. So it really is a weed of open, disturbed habitats, with the exception of pastures up in the mountains. It has become a significant weed of pasture areas. It's a perennial clump-forming grass, so it spreads by wind-dispersed seeds, not by any rhizomes, but those clumps enlarge and become very, very difficult to remove. Now, Miscanthus, once it is established, it is quite difficult to control. Okay, a large clump of Miscanthus can be controlled with a glyphosate application, 3 to 4%, but of course it's going to take multiple treatments. Okay, it's actually better to dig that clump up, but that, of course, in a large infestation means a lot of soil disturbance, which is going to open the soil up for invasion by seedlings and other species. It's really better to do an early detection and rapid response. When you see a clump of Miscanthus on your property, get after that clump before it can go to seed. Don't let it really get established. So early recognition of the problem and interventions will improve your Miscanthus control strategies. Now, young seedlings can be controlled with our selective grass herbicides like Fusilade or Envoy, but the young seedlings are rarely identifiable in these habitats because it's not easy to differentiate a Miscanthus seedling from some of our native grass seedlings. So it really is only later in the plant's life that we recognize it as Miscanthus. Okay, so control it before it goes to seed. Obviously, we don't want those seeds spreading. Now, if you're in an urban area and landscape folks are planting Miscanthus, there are sterile hybrids that can be planted. My Fair Maiden, bred by Tom Ranney here at NC State University, is 99% sterile. Both male and female sterility have been bred into it. So there are new varieties on the market that are sterile that will not contribute to the invasion. Another perennial grass that we have just recently seen introduced into North Carolina is Cogongrass, or Imperata cylindricata. It is a noxious weed. So if you think you see Cogongrass, you need to report that to the North Carolina Department of Agriculture. Right now, it's not widespread in North Carolina. There is a roadside infestation that's being addressed and treated by the Department of Agriculture to try and prevent its spread. But further south, throughout the Southeast and the Gulf states, it is widespread in forests and utility rights of ways and roadsides. So we will get repeated introductions. So this is one we really want to be watchful for. If you see these very distinctive fluffy seed heads in a perennial stand of perennial grasses, that is the telltale sign to look for. Dig down at the base, you'll find these crowns and clumps of, it has a tillering clump forming form for the plant, but it also has rhizomes. So it will form a colony and can be a solid stand. But look for those fuzzy seed heads, dig down and look for the clump and the rhizomes, and the rhizomes will have a very sharp tip to the tip of that rhizome. Again, early detection and rapid response, and in this case, the Department of Agriculture will respond very aggressively to infestations of this. This also includes the ornamental type called red barren. If there are plantings of red barren Imperata in your area, the Department of Agriculture wants to know about that because the red barren is considered invasive as well. Okay, what about forbs, the dicots? Let's move our attention to the dicots of ground covers, whether it be woody or herbaceous forbs like the lesser celandine. These three are some of the more common ground cover type species that I get calls about. Vinca, English ivy, both of course perennial woody plants, and the lesser celandine being a perennial but an herbaceous plant that is non-woody. With our ground covers, herbicide application timing makes a big difference. Okay, fall applications of glyphosate have controlled Vinca minor very well. And in the photograph on the left-hand side, you see the bare area in the center where you see all the leaf litter, and then you see this light green all around it. That area in the center is where we applied a fall application of glyphosate on a stand of Vinca minor. Okay, one application gave us over 90% control. But right in the center of that area was a small patch of English ivy. And that English ivy was growing just fine. So fall applications of glyphosate control Vinca minor, but they were ineffective on English ivy. English ivy, on the other hand, is better controlled with a spring application of glyphosate at 3 to 4 quarts per acre. So you have to use a higher dose than with our microstegium, right? But you've got to use a higher dose on this one and apply it in the spring when it's got 2 to 4 new leaves. And so you see that photograph in the bottom left where you've got that first flush of growth in the spring. That's the best time to apply glyphosate to English ivy. The later you wait in the growing season, the more tolerant English ivy becomes. So in fact, you can control other weeds within English ivy beds with fall applications of glyphosate with little injury to the English ivy. Now, there are exceptions to the rule. I've done this research on English ivy for many years, and I had 1 year where a fall application worked. So there are exceptions to the rule. But generally speaking, spring is going to be better on the woody evergreen species. Vinca, on the other hand, defied that general rule. Glyphosate applied in the fall worked better than our spring applications. Also, when I look at the available information on the internet, one thing I found just this morning when I was doing a little more background research on this information, I found a recommendation out of another extension service for triclopyr to control English ivy. My research shows that triclopyr doesn't work very well on English ivy. Similarly, there are publications that recommend triclopyr for controlling vinca, and my results show that triclopyr was basically ineffective. It did not control vinca. 2,4-D did not control it, picloram did not control it, and several other of the recommended treatments available on the web and in other literature did not work on vinca, and that is from our research trials we did here in North Carolina. So again, the ground covers, the timing of your application makes a big difference in the amount of control you're going to get. What about lesser celandine? Lesser celandine is very different, okay, than the other two I just discussed. It is an herbaceous plant that dies back, but it is a cool season perennial. So it comes up really over the winter months in central North Carolina, and it's flowering in early spring, and it's spreading, it's producing seeds, it produces tuberous roots, it produces tubers. The dominant biotype or ecotype that we have in North Carolina is bulbifera, and so it produces aerial bulbils, and it spreads by creeping stems. So this one can spread in many different ways, but it dies back when weather starts to get warm in the summertime. It's not difficult to control. Glyphosate works on it, auxin herbicides work on it, but because of the tuberous roots, the tubers, and these bulbils and dormant seeds in the soil, you have to do multiple applications over several years to get adequate control. So this is another invasive that will require diligence and persistence to get control. It's most common in wetland areas, stream banks, riparian areas, and urban landscapes because it was introduced as an ornamental plant at one point. It is not really sold for that purpose anymore, but 50 years ago it was, and you can see that in where you find large infestations, there's usually a landscape planting that occurred years ago nearby. Another forb that has been recently introduced, relatively recently introduced into North Carolina is garlic mustard. Now, garlic mustard is a winter annual forb. It's not a perennial, it is an annual. So it germinates in the fall, early spring, in the rosette stage, which you see in the bottom of this slide. It might easily be mistaken for a wild violet of some sort. Okay, so it germinates and grows about in the same time frame and the same habitats as violets, but it is very invasive in forest situations. Germinates in the fall, overwinters as a rosette, and then in the springtime and early summer, it grows upright and produces flowers and seed, typical mustard type flowers and sleek, long, thin seed pods. Okay. These photos that you see in this slide were taken in Boone, North Carolina, in an urban park in Boone. So in those situations, we can control this weed very easily with a pre-emergence herbicide applied in late August. So if the grounds maintenance people in Boone called me and asked for a recommendation, I could give them a recommendation for a pre-emergence application of isoxaben in the form of Gallery or Snapshot or Gemini. They could put that down by the 1st of September, and it would provide pre-emergence control of garlic mustard for the season. In woodland areas, obviously, we're not broadcasting these products. One, isoxaben is not labeled for use in woodlands, right? But we can get post-emergence control with glyphosate or triclopyr or 2,4-D or many other auxin-type herbicides. And we want to make sure we're controlling it before it goes to seed. So applications can be made in fall, winter, a nice warm day in winter, or in early spring, hopefully before most of our natives are emerging, right? So we get that control of this weed and hopefully protect our native forbs from damage. Okay, let's turn our attention now more to our woody plants. Okay, weedy vines obviously are a problem in urban areas and in forests because the vines can cause damage to our trees by climbing on the trees, as you see with the wisteria on the right. And we have a number of weedy vines, but these are 3 of the more common ones. Porcelain berry, I see a lot of porcelain berry in central North Carolina, and for its distinctive fruit. It really stands out when it's in fruit. But before it has fruit on it, you could easily mistake porcelain berry for one of our native grapes, right? Oriental bittersweet, again, is collected in the mountains and sold in the, whoops, I'm not sure what just happened. Sorry about that, folks. I'm not sure why this just jumped, but let me regroup and get back to where we were. Technical difficulties. We're all learning how to properly navigate this from our kitchen and dining room offices, right? Okay, here we are back again. Oriental bittersweet is sold and collected for making wreaths and decorations because of its attractive fruit. But is also a weedy vine that can be problematic in forest areas and very common on roadsides and rail rights of ways and such. How do we control weedy vines? Well, the guidelines are pretty straightforward and very similar to other woody plants. Large vines, we're going to cut those stems and treat the freshly cut stems like we do for controlling small trees. Smaller vines, we can use foliar applications, or we can use implements such as the Felco 19 clippers, or you can use regular clippers and just dip the clippers in an herbicide solution and clip the stems close to the ground. Okay. What do you use? We've done 5 to 10% by volume solutions of Roundup or a generic glyphosate formulation. Triclopyr-amine, not the ester, but triclopyr-amine will also work in these applications. It's very important to clip very close to the ground, because by having the blade wetted with the herbicide solution, you're introducing the herbicide immediately as you cut the stem, okay? And that, through cavitation, pulls the herbicide down into the stem, and it can travel, several inches very quickly in that way, but it's only going to travel so far. So if you clip the stems waist high, it's going to travel a little ways in the stem, and then you get resprouting from the base. But if you clip down close to the ground, It's drawing that herbicide down past the crown and actually into the root tissues, and that can reduce regrowth. Okay. So this can be very useful in urban areas, particularly where you have, a vine growing on a desirable plant or shrub. You can clip close to the ground and selectively control vines in other areas. Kudzu, of course, is probably one of our most widespread vines. Okay, coming into an established stand of kudzu, obviously little clipper applications are not going to be useful. Remember, kudzu is perennial deciduous vine. It is a legume, so that gives us some other options for control. Glyphosate works best applied in late summer or after flowering. We also have Clopyralid or Lontrell, also sold as Transline. That works better in the spring. You do have to use the high label dose to get effective control of kudzu. And there are other control options, milestone, escort, grazing. Bottom line, kudzu is not that difficult to control once you decide you want to control it. Once it's important to you to control it, there are lots of herbicides that are effective on kudzu. The problem, of course, is in an established stand, such as in this photograph, it's going to take years of efforts to really clean that out because of its tuberous roots that are going to continue to reestablish and sprout. And of course, seedlings will emerge as well. Can you do that without chemicals? It is possible. It's just not easy. And we all love seeing the videos of Kudzilla, the skid steer with long hook forks. It rips the vines, not the fines, rips the vines and the crowns from the ground. Now, remember, this is very disruptive to the site. So you're disturbing the site, and so you need a management plan to come back in and prevent the reestablishment of kudzu and privet and other invasives once you have disturbed that site, right? Now, there's a lot of talk about, well, let's graze it. Well, goats and cattle will happily eat kudzu. So if you can fence the area off and get goats or cattle in, they are very effective, but remember, they're non-selective. They're going to eat everything. But in an established stand of kudzu, there's probably not anything else living there anyway. So this is actually quite an effective and good option for controlling kudzu in some areas where you would prefer not to spray, and they are a lot less disruptive to the ground than Kudzilla, the machinery. What about other invasive woody shrubs? What are some of our more common ones there? We've got privet, multiflora rose, Ely agnus, and you've got honeysuckles. There are lots of different invasive shrubs, and the control guidelines are fairly similar for them. If they're small, foliar applications of glyphosate or triclopyr are very effective. If they're larger, cut stem applications do work. Triclopyr ester on the cut stem is very effective. The amine also does work. So if you prefer not to use the ester, which is sort of volatile, then the amine will also work on a freshly cut stump. Glyphosate, a 50% solution in water of glyphosate, also works on cut stems. Maybe not quite as well as the triclopyr, but it does work quite well. Multiple years of treatments are needed. The folks with invasive plant control, report to me that they count on getting about 60% overall control from a single pass. They come back the next year with a second application, often at that point doing a foliar treatment on the regrowth, and they'll get the control up to 90% or more. So remember, with any of our invasives, multiple years are necessary. But just to show you what this looks like, this is some research we did on autumn olive control from cut stump or foliar applications of glyphosate or triclopyr. I'm just going to lean over here and grab my mouse. You can see right here the gray is glyphosate applied to a cut stump, over 90% control. Triclopyr applied to the cuts as a cut stump treatment, also over 90% control. The foliar application, glyphosate, was a little less effective than triclopyr. So we'll see that with a number of woody plants. Triclopyr does seem to be a little bit better, a little more effective on woody plants compared to glyphosate, but both will work. And in this case, autumn olive, it didn't matter which one you used. As a cut stump treatment, they both worked. Some of our shrubs have different life cycles, and that means how we go about controlling them may be different. And this is, for example, remember what I said about the English ivy. A spring application worked better on English ivy because it's an evergreen woody plant. Ligustrum japonicum is an evergreen woody shrub. Fall applications of glyphosate are not particularly effective on Japanese ligustrum or Ligustrum japonicum because it's an evergreen. It is better controlled with a spring application of glyphosate. On the other hand, the Ligustrum sinensis or Chinese privet is a deciduous or semi-deciduous plant, and it is well controlled with a fall application of glyphosate. So know your target. An evergreen like japonica is not as well controlled with those fall applications. Okay. Weedy. So what are some of our most common weedy trees? And calorie pear obviously is widespread weedy tree that has escaped cultivation. It is really not widely recommended for urban tree planting. You can still buy it, but most designers would not recommend it anymore. Ligustrum lucidum, Ligustrum japonicum can become trees. Mimosa, of course, is a prolific cedar and establishes quite well. And the tree of heaven is a colony-forming tree. There are others, such as empress tree, fast-growing, large tree. It has very distinctive flowers that look a lot like our catalpa, our native catalpa. But the empress tree will have large, hairy leaves, hairy on the surface, the top and the bottom surfaces, whereas catalpa will have some hairs on the underside of the leaves, but not on the top side. But the biggest difference between the empress tree and our catalpa is in the fruit. Empress tree will have these hard beaked fruit pods that you see on the bottom left, and catalpa will have these long, slender pods that you see on the right. Well, how do we go about controlling weedy trees? The simplest and best way is to do cut stump treatments, and you can do that with triclopyr. You can use pretty much any of the formulations of triclopyr. Cut it down, cut the freshly cut stump. Don't do this in 2 operations. Don't cut it down and then plan to come back the next day to treat, because that stump has dried out and sealed over. It needs to be a freshly cut stump to do these applications. Alternatively, you could cut it down, let it regrow, and then do a foliar application. But generally speaking, as long as you're doing the effort to cut it down, go ahead and do the cut stump treatment and reduce your regrowth. Okay. In urban parks and urban areas, I do not recommend the use of forestry and industrial or right-of-way type herbicides like Arsenal or Oust. Now, they're very effective for controlling many of our weedy trees in forest areas, primarily pine forests, right? But if you're in a hardwood forest, you've got to be more careful with the use of these products because they can be absorbed by the roots of our desirable trees. And those root-absorbed systemic herbicides like Arsenal and Oust can cause unintended damage to nearby trees when they're used that way. Now, tree of heaven is a little different. Tree of heaven is a colony-forming species. It sprouts from the roots, and so if you cut this tree down, that's going to stimulate root buds to sprout. So we actually do not recommend cut stem treatments with tree of heaven. Okay, we would recommend instead a basal bark treatment or foliar treatments to control tree of heaven. And then once it's dead, you could cut it down. Okay, but again, there are several different herbicide options to control tree of heaven, but it is important to remember the colony forming habit dictates our management strategy. Now, I've talked a good bit about glyphosate and triclopyr. These are the two main tools of the trade for controlling invasive weeds in urban areas. Why? Well, they are effective for controlling many of our broadleaf plants. They're inexpensive, readily available. They're labeled for use in riparian areas. There are formulations of each that are labeled for use in riparian areas as well as terrestrial areas, okay, and in forests. But there are a few other options. Lawntrel or Transline, which contains Clopyralid, is very effective on legumes. So this is more selective than glyphosate or triclopyr and may be useful for controlling legume weeds like Wisteria, Kudzu, or Mimosa. Now, there are other herbicides labeled for use for roadside applications, rights of ways, and forestry situations. But they can have, as I said before, off-target effects on desirable vegetation, so we usually do not recommend their use in urban areas. Again, back to tools of the trade. Chances are you all know what glyphosate is, a systemic, herbicide that controls annual and perennial weeds, primarily foliar absorption, but as I said before, fresh cut stem treatments will work. Triclopyr is available in multiple formulations. Generally for urban uses, I recommend the amine formulation, such as Garlon 3A. There are generic formulations of that. There's an ester formulation sold as Garlon 4, and of course there are generic formulations of that as well. The active ingredient is triclopyr. It's used mostly for woody weed control, and it is better on some species compared to glyphosate. I mentioned the the Elaeagnus control earlier. The shrub Elaeagnus was better controlled with the foliar triclopyr compared to foliar glyphosate. Similarly, porcelain berry and of course wild grape are very, very sensitive to triclopyr, and it works better than glyphosate on porcelain berry. So, but because it is a synthetic auxin, it works very well on a lot of woody plants. We want to be cautious with this one in urban areas where we have desirable plants nearby. So again, as I said, triclopyr does work better on some woody plants than glyphosate. Doesn't mean glyphosate is ineffective on these species. It just means that triclopyr may work a little bit better. Again, two formulations of triclopyr, the amine formulation, good for foliar sprays or cut stump treatments, Garlon 4. The ester formulation is usually mixed with oil for stump treatments, okay? Don't use the ester in the summer because it is volatile, right? Foliar sprays work better in the spring than in the fall, but generally speaking, triclopyr is not as sensitive to the seasonal changes in efficacy the way glyphosate is. Okay. There is a formulation that is often used called Crossbow. Remember, it is an ester formulation of triclopyr plus 2,4-D, and I've seen real problems in urban areas where this was used because both of these compounds volatilize and the vapors can move off the target site and damage desirable trees and shrubs and other plants in the vicinity. So generally speaking, I discourage the use of Crossbow in urban environments. This product can be used also as a cut stump treatment or as a basal bark spray. When you're doing the basal bark spray, the the ester formulation mixed in oil normally will work a little bit better. I mentioned Clopyralid for the Kudzu, but also remember Clopyralid, Lontrell, or Transline works on legumes and asters. So what are some of our common legumes? Kudzu, mimosa, wisteria. So it's going to work on those, but also asters. So for example, if you have some musk thistle coming into your areas, you know, Clopyralid will be a very effective treatment, and it is more selective than Triclopyr. It is also very effective at controlling legumes and asters, as I said, so it can also cause significant injury to desirable legumes and asters. So in an urban area or in a woodland area, if you have redbud trees, you don't want to use Lontrell or Transline near those redbud trees or locust trees because you can get root uptake of the Clopyralid and cause damage to these sensitive species. And of course, anything in the aster family could be damaged. So if you have native forbs, native flowers, wildflowers that are growing in the areas, pollinator garden nearby, keep your Clopyralid away from those areas. What about controlling young woody trees, shrubs without chemicals? Well, there is the weed wrench, okay, and you know, it's not easy, but it does work. And if you have volunteers, this of course is a way that you can get volunteers out controlling some of these weedy shrub species without worrying about the issues of pesticide licenses or pesticide exposure. Goats, of course, like the Kudzu, goats will control most of these weeds as well because goats are non-selective. Does that make them environmentally friendly? Well, remember, they're non-selective. They're going to eat everything. So if you have a heavy infestation of invasives with very few natives in there, then goats can be an effective alternative for cleaning these areas up. If you have natives you want to protect, then probably goats are not the best solution. If you have wet areas in there, the goats usually don't like to go into those wet areas. So you have to assess that on each site. Controlled burns, obviously in forest, controlled burns control a lot of weedy species and brush species. But of course, in urban areas, the population usually is not enthusiastic about controlled burns in those areas. We tried just about everything else to control kudzu. The speed limit sign did not seem to slow down the kudzu out in my town of Holly Springs, but I think they found some ways to control it anyway. I'll end with this slide, and that has a few resources and places you can go for information about invasive species and about invasive species control. And with that, I will be glad to stop and entertain any questions you might have.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Neal. It's a wealth of knowledge. So I'm going to leave this slide up so people can take notes and write down some of those websites if they would like to have that on their side to reference later. So now is question period. So everybody, if you have questions about a specific species or treatment or anything related to invasive, controlling invasive plants, we are going to be doing that through the question panel, which is over on the attendee panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you just type in the question, it'll get directed to myself and Mindy, and then Mindy will help make sure Dr. Neal has a chance to respond to any questions that come in. So we have about 10 or 15 minutes available for question and answer, which is plenty of time to get some good information. So just take a few minutes now and submit some questions. We'll make sure that everything gets addressed with that.
Okay, we have our first question here. John Baker would like to know, will control burning Miscanthus? And if so, what season is most effective?
Miscanthus is a fire-adapted species, so controlled burning is unlikely to impact it. Now, of course, if you did it while the plants were starting to make seed heads, or after they started to flower, you could reduce seed production. But in general, fire is not an effective treatment for Miscanthus.
And then I guess the second part was, okay, that answers the question about the season. Do you think the recommendation of herbicides other than glyphosate is a result from recent media attentions that glyphosate has received?
There is a lot more interest in herbicides besides glyphosate as a result of that. The recommendations that I have in the slide set are not affected by that. Now, that does open the question of, okay, glyphosate. You know, there's a lot of controversy around glyphosate, and if any of you are working for municipalities, then you know the pressures that land managers are under to come up with an alternative. So there are other herbicides that you can use. By and large, you know, they're going to be more expensive, often less effective for general weed control. For woody plants, sometimes glyphosate is the preferred treatment. Sometimes triclopyr is a better treatment. So the position of EPA and Cooperative Extension is glyphosate is still a labeled product. EPA has stated very clearly that EPA does not consider glyphosate to be a hazard. EPA has further stated they do not consider glyphosate to be a carcinogen. So the recent lawsuits come to a different conclusion. So remember, those are jury trials. They're not a scientific panel evaluating glyphosate. I could, and I do, speak on this subject. I just finished an hour-long webinar on this subject, but let me just summarize it to say that the controversy is based upon a report from the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is a unit of the World Health Organization. And they evaluated glyphosate in 2015 and concluded that it was a probable human carcinogen. EPA and the European Regulatory Agency and most regulatory agencies around the world came to a different conclusion. Why? Because the International Agency for the Research on Cancer looked at glyphosate in a hazard analysis. The regulatory agencies look at it in a risk analysis. Now, the difference is risk is hazard plus exposure. So the fact that glyphosate can be a hazardous compound to handle, okay, does not necessarily consider what the likelihood, or doesn't necessarily consider the likelihood of being exposed to enough glyphosate to cause a detrimental effect. And that's what EPA does, is they look at the hazard, but also what's the likelihood of a sufficient exposure. And because glyphosate has very low toxicity, you have to have very high exposure to increase your risk of any detrimental effects. And so what EPA has said is that the routes of exposure do not create a situation where you'd be exposed to enough glyphosate to cause cancer or to cause any other health effects. So that's the crux of the difference between the IARC report and the lawsuits and the media hype versus EPA's scientific review. Okay, and so, like I said, EPA still stands behind the safety of glyphosate and is still a labeled product. It is still relatively inexpensive, and it is generally safer to handle for the applicator than the other products that we've talked about.
All right, thank you. We have a question about controlling bamboo. If you could touch on that briefly, please.
I was hoping no one would ask about bamboo. Bamboo is very difficult to control. Research done up at Virginia Tech suggests that arsenal is effective for controlling bamboo. So if you're in a right-of-way situation or a pine forest situation where bamboo has gotten started, then you may want to use Invasive. Arsenal is one of the trade names. There are other products out there, but Invasive was shown to be effective. In more urban areas, I recommend you start with a big tractor and dig out as much of the rhizome mass as possible. And then you've got multiple choices. You put the whole area into a grass and mow it. It has to be the entire infestation, because regular mowing, and I don't mean just every 6 to 8 weeks, I mean every week, like you would mow a lawn, you can starve out the rhizomes, okay? If you're not going to put it into a lawn area, glyphosate is effective, but it takes multiple applications. So it's very difficult to control, and you really have to be cautious with the use of arsenal, because it is a very effective herbicide for controlling deciduous woody plants as well as bamboo. But again, that is a very difficult one to control.
All right, thank you for that. Someone would like to know what herbicide was recommended for foliar or basal bark control of tree of heaven. So what herbicide?
There have been several different efficacy reports. Escort was one that was recommended for basal treatments, but of course, basal bark applications of crossbow have been effective, or Triclopyr ester have also been effective. But I would recommend anyone that is working to control tree of heaven, I would recommend looking at the resources out of Penn State University. Mr. Art Gover at Penn State University has done several years of research on tree of heaven control, more than anyone else that I know. So I would recommend that you go online and look for tree of heaven control Art Gover, spelled G-O-V-E-R. And he's published some very useful guidelines on the most effective treatments.
Okay, great, thank you. Are there any North Carolina native species that you consider so aggressive that you recommend not planting them in landscapes? Any at all?
How about ragweed? Yeah. Oh, if I sat down and thought really hard about it, I'm sure I could probably find a few, but obviously our native species are generally not as invasive as, or not as weedy as introduced species. How's that for sidestepping the question?
Perfect. Okay, and then on to the discussion of the goats and cattle for controlling invasives. Is there a concern about seeds being left on site after passing through the digestive tract of the animals?
Of course, you know, the seeds are going to be there anyway, right? Whether they're passing through the animals or not, you're still going to have seeds waiting to emerge. So it is important that once you have done, you know, a cleanup operation, such as using goats or cattle to clean that up, you need to have your next step planned. What's next after I have cleaned up this infestation with animals or with tractors and equipment and plows? What comes next? You're going to have the seed of the invasives in the soil, so you've got to plan your transition and then a management plan for that transition. So you want other plants to be planted in that site. So if it's cattle in there, maybe you want to establish pasture grasses in the site. If it's in a riparian area, then you probably don't want big equipment. You may want to plant, you know, plan on a replanting with live sticks of adapted species to that area. But also have a multi-year plan to come back in and do spot treatments to prevent the reestablishment of that invasive species in that site. So the follow-up plan is critical after the fact.
Okay, great. We have a question about what chemical control will be reliable for giant hogweed?
Well, giant hogweed is not that difficult to control. Once you know you want to kill it, but you know you could spray it, but we really recommend that you contact NCDA and let them come out and remove it, because of course you want to get in there and kill it before it goes to seed. And you could use glyphosate, you can use triclopyr, you can use a combination of 2,4-D and dicamba, and they all work just fine, right? But you want to make sure you get it out there before the plants can make seed. But remember, the dead vegetation, the dead stems still have the resins in them, the oils that cause that dermatitis. So even those dead stems are hazardous to handle.
Okay, all right. Can you tell us about any efforts, strategies, or partnerships to address invasive exotics with the ornamental plant industry and growers to reduce invasives on the market or to phase them out? I
would say that the industry is aware of it, but they are responding primarily to market. They're responding to market forces. So if there's a market for calorie pear, there will be growers producing calorie pear. So education of the public to reduce the market for invasives will have a greater impact. The national and state nursery associations, you know, are engaged in this discussion. And so when you've got a very valuable commodity, for example, Miscanthus is approximately $40 million a year in sales. So it's a very valuable commodity. So how do you respond to that? Well, one way of responding to that is not to ban the species, but to promote a sterile variety instead, which actually, you know, it's a win for the industry, obviously. So really, to answer your question is, I would say they're engaged in the dialogue, but is there a systemic movement, industry-wide movement to not grow invasive species? I would say no. Are there individuals and groups within the nursery industry that want to be environmentally responsible? Absolutely, yes. For example, one of the largest growers of ornamental grasses funded the research to develop the sterile varieties. The breeder of Buddleia specifically changed the breeding program to look for sterile varieties of that. So they are recognizing that these invasive species, these species are problematic, and they want to address that, but they want to address it by bringing out a non-invasive form of that species rather than banning the form or withdrawing the species altogether.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm just going to read this directly. Joseph Nusili says, Dr. Neal, at our municipality, we work near a lot of watersheds and reservoirs. We have tried vinegar solutions to control weeds and they don't last long. Is there an aquatic herbicide that would be good for such environmentally friendly areas? That's it.
So, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the vinegar, and you'll notice I didn't mention those vinegar products at all in my discussion. And the reason for that is they work on young seedling weeds, primarily seedling broadleaf weeds and not grasses. But they're not going to control a woody weed. They'll burn the leaves, but that's it. And then the weed just grows right back from it. So that's why I didn't even mention them in my presentation as options. So, so you found, what we already knew is that vinegar and natural oils and similar natural herbicidal products are really just contact action. They just burn the foliage that they touch and do not control the roots. And certainly on a woody weed, they're not going to provide long-term control. So what else could you do in a riparian zone? Well, obviously you look at what are the herbicides that are specifically labeled for use for riparian areas. And there are several that are specifically labeled for riparian and aquatic uses. I mean, there are formulations of 2,4-D that can be used in ditch banks, not in water, but in ditch banks. There are formulations of Triclopyr that are specifically labeled for aquatic and riparian uses. There are formulations of Glyphosate that are specifically labeled for aquatic and riparian sites. Now, having said that, if you want something, if what you're really looking for is something that is not a herbicide, that is natural product to use in a riparian zone, then you're really left with manual removal, mowing, going out there and looking for seedlings, and the seedlings could be controlled with vinegar. But unfortunately, we just don't have the quote unquote natural replacement to glyphosate. I was looking just yesterday, I got an email with an advertisement about a natural weed control product that states that it controls the roots of plants. And I looked at the active ingredient, and that just was not true. It was a contact action herbicide that would just burn the foliage of the plants. So there's some misinformation in on the web about those sorts of things.
All right, I'm going to read off one more question, although there were several more questions, and maybe encourage if there might be a way that people can continue to reach you with their questions. If you wanted to share your email address in the chat or something like that, if you didn't mind, we could have some of these questions directed to you that way. But for now, I'll give you the question. Are native grapes ever considered invasive? Have you seen them become a problem in NC woodlands?
Are native grapes invasive? Well, that depends on, the official definition of invasive species includes it's non-native. So you usually don't see any native species as being said that it would be invasive. But native grapes are very weedy. They, particularly in urban sort of landscaped, managed landscapes, the native grapes can be almost as weedy as porcelain berry. But in our natural forests, it's rare for our native grapes to strangle trees or grow so densely that they would kill or bring down a native tree. So no, we can't say that they're native, but are there weedy native grapes? Absolutely. Muscadine grapes in particular can be quite weedy in urban landscape situations, and they, the seedlings can be pulled out fairly easily within, if you catch them within the first year of their life. Established plants, respond just as I described for porcelain berry and other vines. Foliar application or cut stem treatments are the recommended treatments.
Okay, great. So we have run out of time on other questions, and Dr. Neal, I will make sure that the questions that did not get that we didn't get to answer this time around, we will make sure that gets addressed. I'll get those to you in an email or something with their contact information, and you can follow up with them if that works.
That is fine, and you can also go to my website, and that landscape weed management website, weeds.ces.ncsu.edu will, on that you can see my contact information.
Okay, I appreciate it. So just to kind of close things out, I know we're a couple minutes past our time, but we had a lot of questions to try and get to and a lot of valuable information. So we were approved for a variety of different continuing education credits. I have them listed up on the site now. The way for you to get those credits will be included in the post-webinar survey. So make sure you fill that out so that I know which credits you're wanting to get approval for. I will be submitting the credits for ISA, landscape contractor, pesticide, and forester. You will be getting a certificate of attendance for your record so that you've got confirmation for that. And for the folks that want NC-BOLA, I will be emailing around the course codes for that one so everybody can make sure they can do the self-reporting for that. So we're able to get a lot of credits for this one, so make sure you fill out that survey, and so that way you get the credits. And then just to make sure you're aware, we have 2 more webinars in our Fall Carolina Canopy webinar series. So if you've not taken a look on our events page, go ahead and take a look. These are the 2 that we have coming up at the end of the month and then the beginning of November. We'll have 2 more in that to finish out our education for 2020. And then shockingly enough, we'll be into 2021 before we know it. So I appreciate everybody taking the time out of their day to attend today's webinar. I hope you enjoyed it. Dr. Neal, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to present today and to pass along all this really useful information and knowledge. And I'll follow up with you with the questions that we weren't able to get to this time around. So with that, everybody, you're welcome to enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you back here in a couple of weeks.
All right. Thank you, Leslie.
Yep. Thank you, Joe. I appreciate it.
Thank you all for coming.